My name is Nikki. I'm a senior at Lowell High School. I've been involved with YACS since my freshman year, mostly through the photography class, and I've been on the youth advisory board since last year. Um, so this week is the Youth Art Summit, obviously, and the Youth Art Summit is a project facilitated by Youth Art Exchange. It's an annual gathering of young artists and arts educators, and it's the only event of its kind in the Bay Area. The Youth Art Summit is a celebration of young artists and their vibrant contributions to the creative and cultural fabric of the Bay Area. This is our 10th year, and now more than ever, art is essential for connection and reflection, social change, and building community, especially for youth. Youth Art Exchange exists to make sure that San Francisco public high school students have this critical access to the arts. Our mission is to spark a shared creative practice between professional artists and public high school students, furthering youth as leaders, thinkers, and artists in San Francisco. We offer free multidisciplinary arts programs after school, in school, and during the summer. Our vision is that every public high school student in San Francisco will have access to meaningful, in-depth arts education that amplifies their voices. And I know that everything is very hectic right now. I'm sure you all just got off school or from work. So thank you for being here to listen to this presentation. And if you could, we would really appreciate it if you renamed yourself to include your pronouns. We also wanted to acknowledge that here at Youth Art Exchange, we are joining from the land called Yalamu, known to us as San Francisco. And it's the ancestral territory of the Ramaytush Ohlone people who have continuously lived upon and cared for this land since time immemorial. YACS honors Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, here and around the world, and we wish to pay respect to local elders, including those of the lands from which you are joining us virtually today. Finally, if you have any questions throughout the event, feel free to put them in the chat through the little chat button. You can either private message either me, Sophia, or Claudia, and Claudia will try to answer it for you. So Claudia is obviously our presenter today. Claudia is an alumnus of California College of the Arts, having graduated from the painting and drawing program in 2016. After graduating, Claudia worked at the DeYoung Museum in the Special Programs Department, but is now working as an admissions counselor at CCA. So take it away, Claudia. Thank you.
Thank you guys so much. Hi. Yeah, my name is Claudia. I am one of the admissions counselors at CCA. Yeah, having graduated in 2016, it feels like 100 years ago. Time has gone by so quickly and yet slowly, specifically in 2020. I don't know. I feel like we've entered into some weird alternate dimension. I'm originally from Miami, Florida. I went to a visual and performing arts high school here, and with the help of CCA, I got a bunch load of scholarship and was able to attend, thankfully. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. I think when I share my screen, I don't actually have access to the chat. I'm not sure, but I will, if you do have a question for me, you can, I will be sure to address it once I finish the presentation. So this is a portfolio workshop that I put together, and I just kind of wanted to preface this by saying that all of the work featured here are students that applied to CCA, are currently attending CCA. We felt that the work really reflected kind of what we're looking for in a portfolio and what we want students to think about. Also, each of these students were recipients of our, okay, that was not me, sorry. Each of these students were recipients of our diversity scholarship, which covers tuition and fees, which is how they were able to attend CCA. So let's get started. Okay, cool. So something that I always tell students to think about when they're developing a portfolio is to really think about their story, your background. I really want to get to know you as an aspiring artist or designer. So don't be afraid to reflect that in your portfolio. So specifically with Itzel, she was one of my students. She's from Carmel, California, but so much of her work is talking about her identity, you know, being a white passing Mexican American, and continuously like having difficulty identifying with all parts of like her culture, and acknowledging her parts of her privilege, but also kind of feeling divided in like these two spaces of like not being American enough, not being Mexican enough. So much of her work is a reflection of that, which I think is so powerful. You know, your voice, your point of view, and your perspective, how you navigate the world is valid, and it's important. And that's something that I think you should be willing to express in your portfolio. So we also have Audrey, who similarly as Itzel is also kind of struggling with her identity, you know, being American-born Chinese, and using her artwork to kind of bridge the gap between those two halves and having to reconcile these two things, and bearing the weight of both being Chinese, being American, and feeling kind of othered or foreign in, you know, within her own community. So those struggles, you know, something that I think is really easy to invalidate is something that is really powerful. And again, like that's what your experiences are important. And, you know, if art is your way of coping and navigating that space, I think that that's really powerful and important. And you should be willing to like share that in your artwork. But then sometimes, you know, your portfolio doesn't always have to be about, you know, your personal struggles as an individual. It could be something you're super passionate about. So specifically with Louis, you know, he developed a branding for this fictional ocean conservation nonprofit, kind of in the hopes of like approaching environmental responsibility in a more literal sense, you know, stating facts and like influencing the viewer to be more environmentally friendly. And that's a core value at CCA. That's something that we really value. You know, and he kind of blended various mediums that he was interested in. So graphic design, photography, you know, digital marketing, to kind of create this multi-platform visual brand with a social justice purpose. And that's something that, you know, we also want you to take into consideration, is that, you know, you can have all of these ideas and they don't all have to be expressed in one medium. You can find a way to like integrate a variety of different mediums into your work, into your portfolio. We really value being interdisciplinary and experimentation. And, you know, sometimes it doesn't have to always look quote unquote pretty. We really value the concept and the idea behind the piece. So, you know, we want you to experiment as much as possible. Okay, sorry about that. So then we also have, you know, Lewis, who was actually a much older student. I think he's like 31 years old, and he decided to like revisit going to school. But he spent most of his like young adult life working in a butcher shop. So he modeled so many of like these pieces, these installation pieces, after his experiences and after the people that he interacted with on a daily basis. So not necessarily referencing like the struggles with personal identity, but, you know, his everyday experiences as a young adult, which I think is just as powerful and just as meaningful. And it's also like visually like very appealing how he documented. But we'll get into documentation later. But then, like, you know, I included this piece from my student Maya, not because it had any super like deep, meaningful idea behind it, but I think it kind of goes to show like things that you're interested in, we want to see in your portfolio. So, you know, specifically with Maya, they were thinking about, you know, creating objects. Like she was really interested in graphic design, And it would have been really easy for her to just kind of, you know, design this on like illustration or whatever, InDesign, I don't know, whatever Adobe thing you use. Sorry, I don't know like the terminology, and I really should probably. But you know, they really thought outside of the box and was like, you know, I'm gonna actually physically create like these tea bags that I'm like thinking about and designing. Something that she was very, very passionate about. So again, your portfolio should be what you want it to be and not what art schools are kind of like dictating to you. That might be a little like controversial, I don't know, but I just speak from personal experience. So then, without having to be like super serious all the time, it's okay to be, you know, playful and have fun in your portfolio. You know, it shouldn't be a super stressful process developing your work. I want you to have fun. I feel like most of the time students are just filled with dread and anxiety when it comes to completing a portfolio, and I don't always want that to be the case. So with Oliver specifically, you know, his work is thinking about like a loose and like simple style, you know, colorful and innocent aesthetics. And, you know, he strives to like keep his messaging like purposely like vague, to kind of like allow the viewers to engage more with like their imaginations. And I think that that's really important. So, you know, think about that as you're going and developing your portfolio. You don't have to be super serious. It doesn't have to be super serious. It doesn't have to have like doesn't always have to have like a powerful like meaning behind it. It could just be like playful and fun, which I think is just a meaningful reflection of yourself as well. So then hitting that same thing with Saul. I mean, his work is a little more subtle, and thinking about, you know, merging like humor and like caricature. You know, the piece on the left, well, I guess my left, maybe you're right, I don't know. You know, is example of like him playing with like character designs and just again, being like playful. But meanwhile, like on the piece on my right, is an example, was kind of like his take on like retro images from like the 1950s of like couples kind of posing on the beach. I don't know if you've actually seen any of those pictures, but you know, he wanted to put his own spin on it based off of like his personal experience. You know, thinking about like stereotypes around like masculinity specifically as it relates to Latin culture. So again, being playful, but like being really subtle and like integrating these themes, I think is another way that you can kind of approach building your portfolio. I need a little water, sorry. So I mentioned before like experimentation. I think experimentation is so, so important and it's so valuable, especially because, you know, sometimes we don't have the means or the ability to afford canvas and like, you know, watercolor paper all the time. Because unfortunately, art supplies are super expensive. And I know I didn't always have the financial means to kind of support using those materials constantly. So with Enya, she was in a similar situation. She actually went to my high school. But she used cement blocks that she found just kind of like laying around her house and painted on like either side of them and created this like really interesting installation piece, which I think is like beautiful. It kind of like speaks to the overall narrative of her portfolio, because she immigrated from Cuba to the United States when she was 7. And like at the beginning of her practice, it really focused on like reclaiming the memories and like coping with the trauma of like being removed from her country. So I think that, you know, think about also how the materials can further inform your overall concept and idea when you're developing your portfolio. And then similarly with Naya, you know, using these unconventional and like found materials to study and explore her own identity. You know, she talks about being multiracial and like, again, kind of like struggling between those two identities and having to feeling like she has to choose between the two. So she wanted to create pieces that visually represented like her struggles, with different faces on either bottle, and like kind of distorted and disfigured and interesting in different ways. But then sometimes, you know, you're experimenting just for the sake of experimenting and seeing how, you know, certain materials work with one another and how you work with them. I think it's really important to, you know, investigate different materials and see how you can use them later on in different pieces. That's why I really, you know, implore students to, you know, take advantage of their sketchbook and think of their sketchbook as like kind of a soundboard for their ideas, or it's just like, well, I don't know really how this is gonna look, you know, if I were to do a large piece, but let me see how this looks maybe in my sketchbook, or do like something on a much smaller scale, which is what Maya did here. So she ended up playing around with this and then integrating it in a much larger scale, in another piece in her portfolio, which is why, you know, I think it's really important to include sketchbook pages, like maybe 1 or 2, and to remember that sometimes some of your best ideas come from your sketchbook and you don't even know it. So pretty standard for every single school. The portfolio requirement is 10 to 15 pieces, and that can kind of be overwhelming. Usually students feel the need to do the maximum 15, and you definitely don't. It doesn't make a difference whether you do 10 or 15. But something I always tell students is, you know, to break up your portfolio and to think of them as like different series. And that's what Melissa did. So she kind of divided up her portfolio in 2 different series. This shoe series, this is actually only 3 of them. There are 2 others, but for the sake of this presentation, I could only put 3. Only so much can fit on the slide. But, you know, she wanted to take a critical view of social and like cultural issues. And, you know, the reason why she used shoes, one, because, you know, it's an everyday object that we kind of don't really think about. And it's something that we can all kind of like connect to. Like, you know, we all have like a pair of shoes. But she wanted to show like how easily like overloaded a person suffering from mental illness can feel, or like any addiction, you know, and she feels like it's important to help the community and to connect with people, because so much of the time, you know, the stigma around mental illness and addiction is like very damaging and still like very, very taboo. So again, in choosing the shoe, it's like a very, very common item we use in our everyday life. And she wanted to make that connection, because anyone can really suffer from mental illness or addiction. And it's not something that we should like look down upon or frown upon. It's something that we should, you know, we should always support people. So I think that that's something that was really valuable with these pieces. And again, it was kind of a series that she did. So, you know, don't be afraid to like have, you know, maybe if you're thinking about submitting 10 pieces in your portfolio, you can have a series of 5 and another series of 5. And again, sometimes that's easier, like breaking it down like that. That's not to overwhelm yourself so much. So then similarly, Sophia is using her photography to explore her Italian heritage and the everyday life of like the workers throughout the village that her family is from. And what also like connects these pieces aside from the concept is also like, you know, the color story and the framing of the pieces. It's like you visually see that connection without necessarily having the context of like what it means. But I think something to remember, at least for CCA, is that for us is that you're not applying to you're not applying to the program, you're applying to the school. So, you know, you can be like a painting major, for example, and you can still submit a portfolio consisting entirely of photography. Because again, we don't want students to make like programs, we don't always want them to make program specific work, because we feel like it takes away from their ability to like really explore like the nuances of all these programs, because they're all like interconnected. you know, painting informs architecture, graphic design informs photography, and vice versa. They all cross over with one another, and you can learn different things from different programs and find ways to integrate that into your practice. So me being a painting and drawing major, I took a lot of sculpture and textiles classes and integrated that into my practice. So, you know, we don't want you to like close yourself off. We want you to have as many opportunities as possible. So again, you know, also that, you know, think about like the process of like making your work. You know, sometimes, you know, you go through like various steps to create the final product, or maybe, you know, you want people to like engage with a piece on a different level. It's like more interactive. So what does the process of like that interaction look like? Which is what Tony was thinking about, creating like this physical environment for people to interact with, and then without having to actually see what's inside, and then kind of like drawing what it is they were feeling. So kind of using different senses to kind of like create like this final like product of like these drawings, and to kind of like have a different understandings of like their experience, you know, touching like the physical piece, because that was the whole process. Like you would just like kind of put your hand in and like feel around, and then kind of draw what you feel. So, you know, he wanted to be able to see like different interpretations of like this foreign entity inside the box, which I think is cool. And that's an interesting process, thinking about how, you know, the viewer engages and interacts with a piece. But then there's also just like, you know, the before and after, like I mentioned. So with Itzel, she was the student that was featured on the first slide. She kind of wanted to show the process of like making this piece, and, you know, kind of like how she was playing it out, you know, what she was thinking about, and then, you know, the changes that she made. So I always encourage students to kind of like show those process images. I'd like to see how you get from like beginning to the end, from point A to point B. But I will say that if you do submit the process images, make sure it's on the same slide. You can submit it as like a diptych as it is here, or a triptych. You can't submit it on like a different slide and count it as like a different piece, because that's cheating. So something to think about. That's we really want to see, you know, the growth between like the piece and like the changes. And this is only like one iteration that she submitted. She drew a couple and she sent it to me, but for the sake of putting everything on Slide Room, she submitted this one. But it's nice to see like the shift and the changes. Very subtle. You kind of like have to look carefully at each piece to see like the differences and the nuances. So something that I am a huge stickler for, and I will mentally dock points on any portfolio, is when they don't have proper documentation. And this is a super basic piece, but this student understood that because it's a three-dimensional piece, it's important that we, the viewer, get context as to like how it exists in space. So it needs to be shot from various angles. You know, documentation can really make or break a piece. And, you know, you want your piece to look its best. And it doesn't mean that you have to have a super fancy camera to do it. I'm pretty sure the majority of us have like a phone with a pretty decent camera. And you can easily execute that just using your phone with like a white sheet as a backdrop, you know, very clean, no distractions. And when you submit a sketchbook page, I know that sometimes students have like the sketchbook with the spirals. Just crop out the spirals. Please crop out the spirals. It drives me crazy when I see the spirals of the sketchbook. It's like a pet peeve of mine, and I can't stand it. And I tell students to always just crop. And you can just kind of like put it on a white background, and bam, you're done. So presentation. I don't know how many times I can stress the importance of presentation. And again, so like, you know, presentation is also thinking about how the piece looks when it's installed in space. So that's what Maya was thinking about. She wanted the viewer to get the context of it like when it's sitting like in a gallery setting, especially because there are three-dimensional pieces involved. And then with the piece on my left, you know, thinking about how a person is interacting with the piece and like capturing that moment is really important. But look at how like clean and perfect they are. Like I love it, which is why I included it, because it's like the pieces on their own are pretty simple, but again, oftentimes the documentation can like really elevate the piece. And lighting is also really important. You know, whether it's intentional or not, like, you know, the shadows of the piece on the right, I think make a huge difference in the piece and like kind of like adding a little bit of like drama to it, even though that wasn't always her intention. But again, you know, thinking about how things are positioned, the lighting, and again, just the overall presentation is so important. So then lastly, you know, I want you to show me like what you can do, like what are you good at, what are you passionate about doing. You know, every school is different, I will say. Every school is going to have different portfolio requirements. But with us at CCA, like, I really want you to think about, you know, things that you're interested in doing, what you're interested in talking about. And I don't want you to be afraid to kind of like, you know, experiment and have things be messy. And to talk about things that, again, that are personal to you as an individual. You know, your story matters, your point of view matters. I know that sometimes you're told, oh, you know, we need to submit observational drawings and, you know, figure drawings. And, you know, that's all fine and dandy, but I always tell students, well, what does a figure drawing and an observational drawing like tell me about you? Nothing. You know, how do you stand out in an observational drawing or in a figure drawing? You don't. And I think that your portfolio in conjunction with your essay are your opportunity to really stand out as an aspiring artist or designer. You know, you want to be unique, because that's also like a great way to like get scholarship. And again, it's hard because some schools are like basically saying the opposite of what I'm saying. But, you know, pay attention to the portfolio requirements that these schools have. And, you know, if the portfolio requirements don't really resonate with you, oftentimes that can really inform you on whether or not that's the right school for you. You know, ask yourself, are you more of a traditional artist? Are you more experimental? Because there are different schools that accommodate different artists, and we're not all the same type of artists. So different schools are gonna, you know, provide different like access for us, and help us grow in different ways. You know, for me, I was always a really experimental artist, like dabbling a lot of like mixed media, and you know, I felt that CCA really like honed that in for me, just because they're super interdisciplinary. But I recognize not everyone is, you know, the type of artist that I am, and that's okay. It's okay that we're different artists. That's why it's important to, you know, do your research and think about, you know, the values of the school, the curriculum, and what they're offering. You know, don't blindly apply to a school because everyone else is applying to it. It doesn't diminish your worth if you don't apply to one school that everyone else is. You're just different. And there are so many good art schools out there that will accommodate your needs. So that's something that I really want you guys to, if you're going to take away anything from my presentation, definitely take that away. And again, this portfolio workshop is really thinking about what we're looking for, but I think that it's important when just creating a portfolio in general. And, you know, I can't stress enough that ultimately your portfolio should be about you, and should be a reflection of your interests. So, I mean, again, some people might contradict that, but I stand by my statement. So yeah, that's pretty much the end of my presentation. I wasn't going to do like a super long, drawn out one, hopefully. But I'm happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Also, I can provide a...
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say I can provide a link in the chat for if you guys want like a portfolio review and just like general feedback on your work. I'm happy to do it. There's also an NPD happening this weekend, and I would definitely encourage you guys to attend NPD. Pretty much all of the ACAD schools are going to be in attendance, so nationally accredited art schools, and it's a great way to just kind of get feedback. And I encourage you to meet with as many schools as possible, because it's important to get different sets of eyes on your work.
There are 2 questions in the chat. I don't know if you see them from Brianna. Would you suggest putting series together onto one slide or image, or splitting them up into individual slides?
So a series, they can be, you can put them together as like a triptych or a diptych on one slide, or they can be submitted separately. So you can do either or, kind of depends on like your preference. And think about like how it visually looks with your piece in like the portfolio, but either or is fine. I would say don't put maybe more than 4 in one, like one slide on slide room, just because depending on like how like the image is compressed, I don't think that that's the right terminology, but you don't want the size of the file to be super small on slide room, because then we can't see it. So I hope that answered your question. And then what was the?
And then the other one is, can you talk about how to craft an artist statement?
Yeah, an artist statement. So do you mean like within the context of like your essay, or just like in general, an artist statement? Because I think those are 2 different things that sometimes for college essays. Okay, yeah, because usually college essays have like really crappy prompts that are just like super unhelpful. I'm always like, can you change them? Because they kind of suck. So I will say, you should never, under any circumstance, start your essay with, I always knew I wanted to be an artist, like ever. I like mentally throw that in the trash and I like check out when I see that. Or like, since I could hold a pencil or a paintbrush, or like my parents told me that I could do this, or just don't do any of that. I think a good place to start off when it comes to crafting your artist statement is thinking about how you got to the place of making your artwork. So what was kind of like the trigger for you? So ask yourself, you know, what your art is about. And then how did you get there? So an example, my artist statement was about my, connected with my work, obviously. My entire work was about the fact that I was losing my ability to see in my left eye, and I had been since I was 3 years old. So I kind of started my, I started my essay with talking about like what my work is. So, you know, it's a series of pieces that is using a variety of different mediums. And then I started talking about like why I was using these mediums. So specifically, I was using pictures from my childhood, and I was distorting the faces, the figures in the images, and I was like layering on top of it to physically recreate kind of what I was experiencing internally, like specifically like what my eye was doing, like in its weird thing. Wow, that was like a horrible framing of what I was saying. But anyway, basically, you know, ask yourself how you got to this point of like creating this work, and why is it that you're making this work. And don't be afraid to add in like, you know, I'm using these specific materials for this purpose. You know, it's kind of like a symbol for something, you know, whatever that might be. So I usually think that that's a good way to start off the artist statement, is like asking yourself those questions, which is why I think it's important that your work be a reflection of you. So, because it's kind of hard to craft an artist statement based off a bunch of figure drawings and observational drawings, because those don't really have anything to do with you. So I also would say, and I might get in trouble for saying this, or, but I usually tell students to kind of disregard the essay prompts on the college applications, and just, you know, get as personal as you are willing in your essay. So like talk about your experiences, talk about your life, talk about your work. So, you know, my student Itzel, who again was featured in the presentation, her entire portfolio was talking about, again, or her entire essay was talking about her struggles being a white passing Mexican American. And then how like specific like experiences that she's had, that her father has had, specifically, you know, like people referring to her father like using like a lot of racial slurs, how that prompted her to, I guess, want to be an advocate and then use her portfolio to tell kind of that story and to kind of chronicle that journey. So I think, again, like trying to make the connection between the two, I think is important. You mentioned during the portfolio that sometimes art doesn't have to be too deep or related to identity. How would you craft an artist statement around that? Well, if your artwork isn't related to your identity, what is it about? And I think that's where you start to craft your essay. I think that even though your portfolio doesn't have to be super deep and like related to your identity, there should be reason and intention behind it. You know, you can't just like say you draw an image of a cat. And I'm just like, well, why are you drawing an image of a cat? It can't just be because I like cats. I would say, like, why would you want to go to art school if you just are drawing cats for the sake of drawing cats? Like, I don't know, are you making like some weird like reference to Tiger King? I don't know, like, so like what's the intention and the purpose behind the work that you're making? And again, it doesn't have to be super deep and like identity based. So like one of the examples was the student that created the conservancy. And they did that because they're super like, interested in like environmental sustainability and thinking about how like we're polluting the oceans. So what are you interested in? And if you're making your work about that, that's how you make that connection, and that's how you kind of like go into drafting the essay. Would those elements be the same thing? Oh wait, that's two different questions. Would those elements be the same things you should include in the description of the slides? So definitely write about each of your pieces in slide room. And I think that the point of the description box in slide room is to talk about the pieces as individuals. And I think your essay, your artist statement, whatever you want to call it, is your opportunity to kind of bridge the connection between all of the work. Make the connection for the viewer. So the viewer is me in this stance, in this specific example. So I think that's, so you can take bits and pieces from like this description boxes in slide room and then into your essay. And again, kind of just like make it a little more formal, I guess. You're like kind of like putting it together neatly. Does the way I organize my pieces on slide room look the same for me as it does for the counselor? Like, is the layout the same? Should I think more about how the images look with the pieces around all 4 slides or next? So I don't actually know how it looks when you guys are putting it together. I don't know from like the student perspective. It's not a requirement that you think about, you know, the layout and the flow of the pieces unless you feel it's important that you kind of walk the viewer through like a specific journey. And sometimes like it doesn't make a difference and sometimes it does. It just kind of like depends on like the work overall. But I wouldn't stress that way too much because that's just like way too complicated. But sometimes it's like nice for you to like walk the viewer like on the same journey that you went. So maybe you started off doing, you know, small hand drawings, and then you slowly and gradually like went to like large paper drawings, and then maybe you went to like sculptures, and then you started doing like installation pieces. So you can definitely like walk the viewer on the journey, but it's not a requirement that you do that. Bye.
I'm not sure if you mentioned this earlier and I missed it, but for the portfolio pieces, I know that some colleges want to see like progression like throughout the years. So is it important, like would you say it's important to add pieces maybe from like when you were younger to like show progression, or would you just say stick to your best pieces?
I would say stick to your best and most recent pieces. I think what they probably mean by progression is like the progression like within, you know, your ideas and like the concept. So like, you know, maybe you had this one idea and you were kind of working with it in like this one medium, and it like gradually evolved into something else. I don't think that they mean, I'm pretty sure that they don't mean like submitting stuff from your sophomore or like freshman year, because schools definitely don't want to see stuff from your sophomore and freshman year just because it's not your most recent work. So yeah, like usually junior, senior year, and again, the work that you're most proud of. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. Maybe we've entered, it's 2020, anything is game at this point. So maybe for some reason, some schools actually want to see freshman and sophomore work. I highly doubt it, but knock on wood in 2020. So at that point, like, you know, it's important to reach out to those specific schools that are, you know, stating that and asking for more clarification. Because again, every school is different. Does anyone have any other questions? You can definitely like put it in the chat. And I'm going to put a link to appointments if you want a portfolio review. Usually all of the portfolio reviews are with me anyway. I'm pretty chill, I swear. The 30-minute portfolio reviews. I'm also going to put the link to National Portfolio Day because I think it's really important. It's also free. It's just a great way to get like feedback. And there's honestly no reason to not do it. It's really helpful. I did it when I was a junior and a senior. It's also a great way for you to like connect with the counselors for each school, because they're going to be like kind of your first in when it comes to like acquiring scholarship. And obviously, like again, our school is expensive, so scholarships really matter and are super important. So don't be afraid to kind of hound the counselors. So like, please, like you can email me all the time. Like it's my job to respond and like help you out. So yeah, just kind of be willing to like engage with the counselors, because they're honestly like, we're here as a resource and we're here to help you guys through the process.
For National Portfolio Day, are they just looking at like your pieces and giving you feedback, or are they like speaking more on the process actually?
So whatever work that you show them, that's what they're going to talk about.
Oh, okay.
So you kind of get to pick what pieces you want to include.
And like for somebody like me, I'm still a junior, so I'm, you know, I haven't started the portfolio process. I could just show like my pieces and you could just give me feedback on that, like even if it's not necessarily something that would go into my portfolio.
Yeah, because I mean that could be a good you know, jumping off point. So maybe you know, in those pieces you're playing around with like interesting materials or like interesting themes or concepts, and that's, you know, I'm there to be like, this is cool, this is something you should maybe like consider doing more, maybe try exploring using these materials moving forward. You know, it's also just kind of a dialogue where it's just like, well, what are you thinking about in your portfolio? You know, as a junior, you're kind of done with the foundational stuff and now you're kind of working more independently. and you're starting to think about a portfolio. So what are some things that you're interested in? What would you like to pursue? What mediums do you like? So it can be a dialogue. And that's where I think like your sketchbook is really important, and showing images of your sketchbook. Because again, some of your best ideas are coming from your sketchbook and you don't even know it.
Yeah, totally. Thank you.
Yeah, of course.
If there aren't any more questions, and you can continue putting them in the chat, just wanted to remind everyone there is another workshop from Bay Area Video Coalition at 4, so in 10 minutes. And they're presenting on designing a television program based on community engagements. And there is also, of course, the final culmination of the Youth Arts Summit tomorrow from 4 to 5:30. And it's, you know, like everything. So definitely check that out. And then also the online gallery, which we can provide a link to in the chat. And that's, you know, all of these organizations across San Francisco, you know, submitting art, and it's great. So also definitely check that out. That's all the reminders that I have. If anyone else wants to say anything. Thank you, Claudia, for the presentation and the answers and tips. It was really helpful for, you know, everyone here. So thank you for that. And thank you for everyone else for joining us today.
Thank you guys for having me. Always happy to do another portfolio workshop for any students that missed out. So yeah.